Welcome to my first video on the D&D classes that, well, make up D&D. So, what better way to start than alphabetical order? So, generally, in this series, I'm going to go over the history would be, I guess, a good word to explain it. Well, I'll go over the history of each class of D&D, but in a way more like of their culture, or where they come from, or the idea of them comes from. You'll see better, I think the Barbarian is a perfect example, as we get a mix of fictional stories, popular conception, and history. But, of course, I can go on all day about what I'm going to do, so let's just start with the Barbarian. I'm starting and doing this all in alphabetical order, if you guessed. And now, where better to start with the Barbarian yeah, I see you over there, Conan, but you can just wait. So, the Barbarian, as an overview of a character, is a character who is generally a strong, well, in mechanical terms, he's really strong. I guess you don't have to, but that's not the point. Overview, strong, tough as nightmares, really, and savage, dangerous, and generally does not like civilization, for they see him as weak. But, that's obvious. But let's go over some ideas, man. So, we're going to start with the beginning. And by the beginning, I mean the Stone Age, Neolithic, caveman days. Now, as an overview, my personal opinion, I honestly think that there's a lot you can do, especially with barbarians, by looking at the history of real-life examples. I'm going to do that a lot in this series, so I think it came in as an interesting place to start. I'm going to call it this caveman/Stone Age days. I'm not going to be super specific, as the exact specifics don't entirely matter. Just a general idea. But there's a lot of interesting stuff you can do. I mean, for instance, I don't believe that every caveman, or even necessarily most of them, would be barbarians. I think most of them, 9 out of 10, give or take, would belong, if you're trying to classify them in a class, as more fighters, druids, some rangers will be likely, minus, a lot of their equipment. Maybe a few clerics if you really wanted to push it, but I honestly feel these are like, as far as religion goes, they'd be more druids, but because they're supposed to be like the old people, but that's not important. We're talking about barbarians. However, there would definitely, my personal opinion, if I was classifying those days as classes, they would be barbarians. They would have to be barbarians. I mean, they would be the barbarian, he's wearing a leather pelt, or just enough to not come off as culturally weird for whatever time that is. Goes around, with a bone axe or something, killing the local bears, and if it's fantasy, he might be slaying dire bears or dinosaurs or whatever the order of the meal is today. However, at this time, if we were really going back to the old caveman days of humanity, the barbarians do lose an aspect of them, but I'll touch on that later. I'll explain it towards the end of the video. So I feel it's time for a bit of a time jump, as I feel the next major development in barbarians is the days of the Roman Empire. When I mean days, I mean more like their waxing and waning days, specifically. As the Romans, overall, very important jump, I'm going to be talking mostly about the Germanic people, the Germanic tribes and such that lived in, Germania and a few other places in Europe. But a very important is that Romans consider, basically, and this is kind of something you can see in a lot of cultures at the time, they would consider anyone that wasn't Roman oftentimes to be a barbarian, under technical definitions. So, yes, if you're playing yourself in a D&D game and you wanted to come up with a justification of why you'd be a barbarian, even though you don't even know how to swing an axe, there's your definition, because we all technically are barbarians. But that's under very loose definitions, and doesn't really help here. But, so, calling everyone a barbarian based on Roman definition is terrible, because Romans basically thought everyone is a barbarian. However, what I call the Germanic people, or as I'm going to for them today, the Germanic barbarians, is a pretty well fit, as they serve a lot of interesting aspects about them. And though there's definitely a lot of you-know-who in the barbarian we know of in D&D, but you can trace some interesting roots back to them. Just look at the artwork they have. So they're kind of like these people who fought, they were Germanic tribes, they people to the north. They kind of held off the Romans, kind of didn't. It's a confusing mess. I had to look at the Roman history, which is a mess all in itself. But, they're the ones who toppled the Roman Empire and sent the European world into the Dark Age, or really the world itself. The Dark Age, we all know the Dark Ages, and ended up founding the kingdoms that would be it. But there's a very interesting idea where they're like these tribal people, not like tribal, but wilderness people who lived in the more ruthless and less tamed country, as Rome would be a little more stable due to the Romans. Especially also goes to like Celtic people, because they also kind of fit in this definition, but that's just kind of obvious. I'm very happy skipping in here. This is not going to be like a super in-depth video where I go over the details of every single group, as that's more of a historical discussion, to be honest. And not something we're doing here. Now we go to Viking berserkers, because those guys are literally, I just smell the barbarian all over them. That I don't even have to explain. This also comes down to something very important. Where, just to be clear, no, not all Germanic people or Vikings were barbarians, especially the Vikings. It's like, quite frankly, most of them will be fighters, probably some rangers, maybe a rogue or two, and probably some clerics. Yeah, definitely some clerics, especially if there's like a fantasy version of the Vikings where they got magic. Clerics everywhere. I don't think there'd be as many druids as you would think. But maybe if you really want to stretch it, you could stretch the paladin, maybe, but that's not really important. But the berserker, goes into battle, basically, charges into battle, slaying their enemies in brutal, vicious combat. You know what I mean? They were incredibly vicious in history, oftentimes. And not something you want me in a dark alleyway. So there's a lot of inspiration you can take from those guys, and I highly recommend you do, as if you want to play Barbarian with perhaps a bit more of a spiritual aspect, especially. So, if you happen to be playing the Path of the Totem Warrior, that would be a very good place to take it, especially if it's like because it's like a bear. A bear is a perfect example. Playing one of those, I highly recommend taking the bear. It's a wolf, maybe, if you really want to stretch it there. Especially if like Fenris. But that's going deeper than I really want to. Now, probably what you've all been waiting for, Conan, the Barbarian. Who, if I'm going to specify this, probably a mix of Barbarian and Rogue. But that's more of something. But I'm going more of the general conception of him, and, he is a Barbarian under most definitions. Conan the Barbarian, as we all know, lives in the Hyborian Age, which, effectively, we're going by my timeline of events, would be before the Stone Age, but it's more technologically advanced most of the time. But Conan, he's the ruthless warrior, goes out, fights creatures, gets gold, sneaks around occasionally because he has a bit more cunning than you often associate with a barbarian. Usually with some, people all around. For some reason, half the people in the setting don't know what armor is, even though quite a few bits of our working sections obviously display the fact that even Conan will occasionally use armor. So, all those images of Conan not wearing armor, yeah, that does happen a lot of times, but there's just quite as many times he's wearing armor, because, arrows hurt, I imagine. But Conan is definitely an interesting idea, that though he's seen as the idea of where barbarians come from, and he is to a lot of extent, he's a bit more interesting, as he often relies a bit more on his cunning, his not intelligence. He wouldn't have a particularly high intelligence in D&D if you were trying to misstat him, but you have a high wisdom. Conan's cunning is almost as cunning as he is brutal. If you caught the reference, yeah, you. But so overall, Conan does really help, and this is where we really get the idea of barbarians having this idea that they were all they were, they're these tough people that live in the wilderness, and they don't like the trappings of civilization, for it makes men weak. You know what I mean? That kind of stuff. That if you're playing Barbarian, you're almost certainly taking inspiration in that category. Which is fair, that's a very interesting part of Barbarian society. However, I feel it's a lot, I wouldn't confuse it for stuff like druids or even hippie things, where it's like, oh, nature man, it's more like, no, modern society makes people weak. Not so much that technology itself is weak, since they clearly don't have things against it, at least at the Iron Age weapons. I'm not entirely sure what their opinions on guns would be. Probably probably something to think of seeing as dishonorable to fight at such long ranges. Although, I'm not entirely sure about that. If we're going by D&D logic, they don't have any range immediately, I think of, but I don't think there's anything necessarily stopping you, of course, if you get proficiency from playing a barbarian with a bow or a crossbow, or if you play in a setting or whatever they let you have guns. A barbarian with guns, a gunbarian. Try that sometime. Gunbarians. Might have to make that a Drive Through RPG supplement. But this is something that has become ingrained in barbarian culture, and this is my personal opinion of what hurts the barbarian and why we don't see a lot of modern barbarians or kind of things. Because the barbarian is really built, oftentimes, around the idea that the civilized people that he often associates with, or at least meets on his journeys, is weaker than him because he comes from a tough land where people are tougher. And though that is, and that thing is, like, if you notice where barbarians come from, they come from Dark Age kingdoms or societies with technology or lower. They don't really pass that. And I believe the simple reason, actually very simple, is because the barbarian as an idea is really built on the idea that the wilderness has made this man tough. He is tough as nails. Society makes you weak. And though there are definitely elements that you could incorporate into a barbarian in a society post-Dark Age, Renaissance, and onward, and though definitely living in a more harsh environment would make you tougher, but disowning civilization has kind of been disproven, to be honest. I mean, if you live in modern society, you live in the age where it's proven that living in a more civilized world has helped you more than hindered you. I mean, humans on average are taller and stronger than our ancestors who didn't, so maybe less experience in the wilderness, but if you live somewhere where the wilderness is more close by, that's less of a thing. So, the barbarian is kind of a thing that lives in the Dark Age and in the past. It doesn't really something that works in modern day. There isn't like something like where the druid could be mixed with a hippie or something. This doesn't really happen. Of course, D&D is set in a Dark Age, at maybe early Renaissance fantasy, so that isn't really important, but something I wanted to kind of do some work on there. But overall, if you want to get some ideas for your barbarians, your barbarian heroes, or your anti-heroes, or your just guy who's walking along because someone promised him good meat and some money, maybe a nice, attractive woman. I don't know what your barbarian wants. I'm not playing a barbarian at the moment. But overall, I would suggest if you want to spice it up and have your barbarian be a little bit less of a generic barbarian, if you want to spice it, or just think of cool ideas for your character, then what I taking points for is think about what a Stone Age culture would be like, as that's often an interesting example of what you could interact where your barbarian came from. If you want to take it from Germanic barbarians, or Germanic people, think of an idea where he's seen these great empires and has opinions on them. Whether those be the classic civilization makes you weak is up to your personal debate, or just whatever you want. Berserker barbarians are, well, fairly self-obvious. If you want Viking flavor and want to pray to Thor, then, go gun-ho. And of course, if you want to take after Conan, well, you're gonna need a little more cunning than you would naturally think, because Conan's a bit more on the smart side. So, if you want to play a barbarian that isn't necessarily, that might not be book smart, but is street smart, even though streets might not be something he's familiar with, then take some information from our good friend Conan. And, this is also where we get the idea of them not wearing a whole lot of armor, since though barbarians in the past, though what we consider the barbarians didn't always wear the most armor, he's kind of the idea, even though we see him wear armor. But overall, that's kind of why I wanted to go. This is the first episode of my class thing. I did the overview of the D&D classes. So hopefully you find that interesting and engaging, and gives you different ideas for your characters and your barbarian characters. But, we could give you ideas for settings. I don't know. It could be useful in other RPGs too, if you want to play a character who's like a barbarian, if you don't have a class system like GURPS or something. I don't know. But, hope you enjoyed. See you next time, because next time we're going to continue this on alphabetical route and go to the alphabetical route and go and visit the Bard. See you then.